Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with all of you today, and thanks for joining us. Welcome to Pattern for Progress's monthly housing webinar series. Our webinar series has been generously supported by NeighborWorks America. Today's conversation, 100% affordable housing zoning overlay. Sounds like a mouthful, but it's an incredibly useful tool to increase the supply of affordable housing options while simultaneously streamlining the approval process and maximizing public funding. We're very excited and very pleased to be joined by Cassie Arnaud, Jeff Roberts, and Daniel Messplay from the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Please allow me to take a moment to frame today's conversation. The development of affordable housing is very complex, very lengthy, costly, and is typically not widely accepted. The goal of developing affordable housing is to offer high quality housing at below market cost, albeit rental or homes for sale. These developments and homes provide a great benefit for the residents, local businesses, and the community at large. There's clearly a housing crisis throughout the country, and it is no different here in the Hudson Valley. The cost of land, shortages in supplies and building materials with skyrocketing prices, high demand for housing, and the lack of a skilled labor force, coupled with a lengthy development process, has all been exacerbating the housing crisis and has crippled the ability to actually increase the housing supply. To increase the supply of housing, local leaders, municipal boards, and decision makers must embrace and be willing to work with developers in order to meet the demand for housing, address the needs for our essential workers, and offer affordable options for people living in the communities in which they work. It is neither healthy nor sustainable from an economic standpoint for residential development to occur in such a way that our essential workers cannot live in the communities that they serve. There are a number of tools available for municipalities to achieve a range of housing options and assist in the development and preservation of affordable housing. Here are just a few: inclusionary zoning, density bonuses, reduced lot size, tax incentives, yes, pilots and phase-ins, accessory dwelling units, housing rehabilitation, and the adaptive reuse of blighted buildings. Affordable housing development can only occur through something I call lasagna financing. Affordable housing developers must tap into a number of different layers of financing, from the pre-development stage all the way through lease-up and closing on a permanent source of debt. This is all done through a very competitive process to secure tax credits, grants, and other financing packages. There is no single solution to the challenges of building and preserving affordable housing. Every community is slightly different, and the silver bullet does not exist. Solutions are based on understanding the natural and the built environment. We must also understand the needs of the community, the residents, and the businesses. We do all this to build a sound foundation and subsequent set of strategies and approaches to these challenges. We must address these challenges from a holistic standpoint based on an understanding and appreciation that affordable housing is required for communities to thrive. I think you get the picture. Developing affordable housing is complicated, and the local approval process can take years. We are here this morning for a presentation on 100% affordable housing zoning overlay established in Cambridge, Mass. This policy grew out of decisions with the City Council and Housing Committee to consider policy changes to address the housing crisis. The goal of this zoning overlay is to help affordable housing developers use public funds, create new affordable units more quickly, more cost effectively, and in areas where there are fewer affordable housing options for residents. The AHO was formally adopted by the City Council in October of 2020. So join me in welcoming, and I'm pleased to introduce our guests. This morning we have Cassie Arnaud, the Senior Housing Planner of the City of Cambridge, Cassie has more than 25 years experience in affordable housing policy and finance. She has a master's in city planning from MIT and a BA from McGill University. Good morning, Cassie. We're also joined this morning by Jeff Roberts, the Director of Zoning and Development for the City of Cambridge. Jeff has served in several roles in the City of Cambridge Community Development Department since 2003, with specialized experience in zoning and urban development, neighborhood planning, and open space planning. Jeff has a bachelor's and a master's of urban studies and planning from MIT. And finally, our third guest this morning, Daniel Messplay, is a senior manager for zoning and development in the city Community Development Department. Daniel worked right here in the Hudson Valley for New Rochelle as a senior real estate development manager and the assistant director of planning and economic development for the village of Port Chester, New York. Daniel has a bachelor's of arts in historic preservation from the University of Mary Washington, a master's in urban and regional planning from Virginia Tech with a graduate certificate in geospatial information science, and master's in real estate from Georgetown University. Good morning, all three of you. Welcome, thank you. And I'd like to, at this point, turn our virtual floor over to Jeff to start us off.
Thanks, Joe. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And this is Jeff Roberts. Because we've been doing all these meetings virtually, we've gotten in the habit of making sure that every time you speak, you say your name, because otherwise the minutes don't get recorded properly. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and what we're going to do, I'm going to just go through this presentation, and Cassie from our housing division and Daniel, who works with me in zoning, will be able to fill in. I hope we leave a lot of time for questions. There's a lot to get through. So you probably hear me touching very quickly on some things that if you jot down a note, happy to talk about more as we go forward. So just to launch right into the presentation, this is an adventure in zoning. Just to start with a little bit of context. So Cambridge, if you're not familiar with it, is in the greater Boston region. City councilors in Cambridge like to say that it's a greater Cambridge region. What is sort of different about Cambridge, as opposed to what you might think of as kind of a suburb, is that it really is within this urban core of the Boston area. It's right across the Charles River. It's not so much a suburban pattern of development. It's very much a city unto itself. And in terms of political divisions, and this is kind of relevant as we get into talking about zoning and the affordable housing overlay, despite it being so closely tied to Boston and the region politically, all these different cities and towns you see on the map are distinct and really all have the power to set their own destiny when it comes to land use and development controls. Sorry. Cambridge is one of the more densely populated cities in the country. There's over 116,000 people in about 6 square miles. We've got Harvard and we've got MIT, that you're probably familiar with. We've got Kendall Square, which is the one of the biggest and certainly the densest cluster of commercial life science in the country and possibly the world, probably the world. It's got the most expensive commercial real estate on the Eastern Seaboard, even more expensive than Manhattan. And we have a lot of housing in Cambridge, and there's a lot of very different kinds of housing, ranges from, we have, tens of millions of dollars mansions in parts of the city. And then we also have very, very dense multifamily housing. And housing in Cambridge is very expensive. And the affordability of housing is one of the most significant issues that we have in the city. It's been recognized as such by the city council and by the community in Cambridge for many, many years. And it's really only increased over a period of time. There is in Cambridge a stock of what we would call protected affordable housing, subject to long-term affordability restrictions. It's just under 15% of the housing units in Cambridge, and that's a combination of public housing, deed restricted private housing, some mixed income housing that I'll talk about in a second. So one of the things about affordable housing in Cambridge, and this is that sort of 15% of units kind of shown across the map of the city, is that, you know, as you can see, it's not distributed entirely evenly around the city, and you can see some you know, portions of the city, particularly sort of in this area, kind of towards the lower left, you know, where there really isn't much affordable housing, and those areas tend to coincide with the areas in our zoning ordinance that are most restrictively zoned. So Cambridge is zoned primarily, mostly to allow multifamily housing, but there are some areas of the city with more restrictive zoning that's only allowing single family and two family development. And when it comes to affordable housing in Cambridge, you know, Cambridge has a very long history of planning and work related to affordable housing, and really all starts with funding. I think, Joe, you pointed that out, and it's important to really emphasize that this all kind of begins and ends with funding. In 1988, the city established the Cambridge Affordable Housing Trust, which has been used really extensively over the succeeding years as a really important policy tool to develop affordable housing. So part of the source for that is sort of linkage fees for development. That's one of the main sources of funding. That linkage fee used to be much smaller and has really increased significantly in recent years. But there's city funding that goes into it. There's many other funding sources, and that trust funding is used to leverage additional sources of funding in order to put together that lasagna, as you call it. And Cassie can talk more about that in detail, but I think it's just important to emphasize that none of this really happens without funding. In terms of the regulatory tools, in Massachusetts, there's something called Chapter 40B, which we could probably give a whole talk about, but it was referred to, and often is referred to, as anti-snob zoning. Legislation. It was put in place as a way to create some state leverage over cities and towns, which, as I mentioned before, have really wide leeway to set development regulations. But this law says that there are certain ways that for development that includes affordable housing, there can be relief from local zoning and other local regulations. So the reason to point that out is that in Cambridge in particular, the Chapter 40B comprehensive permit mechanism is something that's been used very often to permit affordable housing development. And when we say, I think the mouthful that you described, we tend to refer to 100% affordable housing. So developments that are entirely deed restricted units with, you know, affordability limits and a whole kind of programmatic element for selection and tenanting and sale, because we have home ownership programs as well. That a lot of that really comes from having this Chapter 40B legislation. But the thing about Chapter 40B that is relevant for this discussion is it is still a discretionary permitting process. It requires approval from the Cambridge Board of Zoning Appeal, or in general in cities and towns, the Board of Zoning Appeal has to approve them. And what that means is that any of these decisions that are made by the BZA are subject to appeal. That can bring a development into land court, which can sometimes take years to resolve that litigation. So while that comprehensive permit mechanism is really useful, it also comes with a lot of risk, and that risk is often a deterrent for affordable housing development that is, you know, that needs to be funded, needs to have some guarantee to be able to secure its funding, and that risk of being in litigation for 2 years, which has happened in various situations in Cambridge, is something that can have a chilling effect on development. So, and then the other thing I'll mention is inclusionary zoning. So just not to completely put that aside, Cambridge had inclusionary zoning for about the past 2 decades. That's produced about over 1,100 units of affordable housing. So a big chunk of that 8,000 units that we saw is from inclusionary, and that's completely leveraged from the private sector. So private, market rate development includes a set aside of affordable units, and they're deed restricted in perpetuity. All right, so now we get into the affordable housing overlay. So starting in about 2015, the city is, as part of this larger prioritization of affordable housing, was really looking at what more can be done. We've had all these programs in place for many years, but what can be done to really do more, because the affordability crisis was just keep getting worse. So so one of the strategies that was talked about was this notion of, well, right now, if you want to develop affordable housing, you often have to go through a discretionary permitting process. You need to get zoning relief. You can do that through the 40B comprehensive permit. But what if you didn't need to do that? What if you had zoning in place that just created an as of right path where affordable housing could be zoned and permitted and not have to seek that relief, and wouldn't be at risk of those appeals and land court cases. So that was just sort of a concept, and it was something that was really thought about. It spent a little bit of time in kind of the study a phase of really trying to figure out how that would work. I probably already talked about this enough, but the affordable housing development is, when we talk about it in Cambridge, we talk about 100% affordable housing. And this is just going back to the goals of the affordable housing overlay really were to create that kind of as of right mechanism that would allow affordable housing developers to look at opportunities for sites. One of the things in Cambridge that's really crucial, maybe more so than other cities, is to develop affordable housing where we don't have quite as much land. There aren't sort of vacant sites or sites that are owned by, the city or by city agencies just kind of sitting there waiting to be developed. When affordable housing is developed, it usually requires going out and acquiring sites. So that having that sort of stability in the zoning would be a way of doing that. It would help to, as I showed in the map before, where there's some areas where there hasn't been as much affordable housing development because of the restrictive zoning, it would create more opportunities for affordable housing distributed more equitably throughout the city. It would create just a more predictable and more streamlined, permitting path, less risk. And in terms of costs, part of the thinking about this was if a particular kind of zoning is created just for affordable housing, how can that be tailored to make the economies of scale work? Because if you're trying to acquire sites in Cambridge for affordable housing, you're competing against market developers who can, when they're building market rate, the values are going to be very high. And it's a lot of it was an equation of, how much affordable housing would you need to be able to be competitive with a market rate development economically in order to acquire sites. So just a quick overview of what happened, of how this all came about. Like I said, between 2015 and 2019, there was a lot of kind of study and consideration taking place. Part of this was through a comprehensive planning process in Cambridge, which was called Envision Cambridge. That was completed in 2019, and part of that process involved going through some of this study of, what's the necessary what's the necessary density, basically. How much housing would you need to build on a given site in order to be competitive with the market? And that came out in 2019 and coincided with the City Council's Housing Committee, including several members of the City Council who felt like this was the time to take this idea and really put it into action. So starting in about March of 2019 and continuing pretty much all throughout the rest of the year was a process of where we on the community development staff put together a zoning proposal, discussed it with the housing committee, discussed it with the City Council, the Cambridge Planning Board, dozens of community meetings, lots and lots of discussion. It was one of the more well discussed and contentious ideas in planning and zoning in Cambridge, certainly at the time, and in much of the time that I've been working for the city. I won't go through all the details, but that's certainly something we can sort of talk a little bit about more if there are questions. In 2019, the way the process resolved was the city council, which is a 9-member city council. They didn't take a final vote on it, but they, as the vote neared and the city council was taking preliminary votes on moving this forward and adopting it into the zoning ordinance, it ended up with a 5-4 majority in support. And in Cambridge and under Massachusetts law at the time, and it's actually changed since then, so we can talk about that too. A 5-4 was not enough to adopt it into the zoning ordinance. It required 6 votes in order to adopt into the zoning ordinance. So it did not get passed in 2019. 2019 was also a city council election year, and there were some changes on the city council as a result of that. Coming out of that in 2020, there was a new city council. There were some new members on the council. The petition was refiled. It was discussed again, more public hearings, and ultimately in October of last year, the city council passed it, and it was a 7-2 vote. So that's the story, and I'll try to do this really quickly because it really gets into the weeds, but just in terms of how the affordable housing overlay works. Cambridge has a fairly conventional sort of zoning ordinance, although when you really dig into it, there's a lot of things that are anything but conventional. There's a range of different zoning districts, from single family to 2-family to multifamily, and then there's a lot of mixed use areas of the city where there's a mix of commercial and residential. There's still some industrial areas, although most industrial areas are kind of converting into some of that the biotech life science uses. And the zoning ordinance has changed a lot. It's almost 100 years old, and it's basically because most of the city, or many of the residential neighborhoods of the city, were developed pre-1924. The zoning ordinance doesn't necessarily dictate what the patterns of development are. It really regulates how things change. So there's lots of, a huge part of the city is not conforming to what the current zoning regulations are. That's the short part of the story. And the idea here, I already kind of mentioned what this was supposed to do. It was supposed to provide an alternative to this 40B process. Instead of affordable housing development needing to seek relief from zoning, there would be a zoning that was specifically written for affordable housing development, and it would permit it as of right. I'll just go through some of the key aspects of it quickly. One is that really the key requirement in the affordable housing overlay is that all of the units are permanently affordable, and it can be affordable up to 100% of the area-wide median, so basically up to the area-wide median income. And there's a little bit of variation how that breaks down in terms of up to 80% of area-wide median income. In some cases, where it's homeownership development, there's a little bit more flexibility for more units to be up to median income. This allows multifamily use throughout the city. Again, it's allowed in most of the city, but in districts where it's not currently allowed, under the affordable housing overlay, multifamily would be allowed. This is kind of a different version of the zoning map. So the approach to regulating development is, I wouldn't call it a form-based code, but we've described it as sort of a more form-based approach rather than relying on density to be the control for development. It relies more on height, basically building height. So in districts of the city that currently have a limit that would limit development to about 3 stories, the affordable housing overlay says you can build up to 4 stories. And then in districts where the zoning currently allows 4 stories, it allows you to go up to 6 stories. And in all other districts, it allows you to go up to 7 stories. So there are some districts of the city that allow higher rise development, but there were a lot of concerns about what the implications might be if you relaxed development restrictions and allowed high rise development as of right in those areas. So really, a decision was made, a conscious decision to say, the affordable housing overlay is only going to allow development up to 7 stories. And after that, you're back to the base zoning, or you're seeking relief using the comprehensive permit process. Just a little bit, we put together a lot of diagrams to try to illustrate to people what these results might look like in context if you took typical lots in residential areas where the height limit's 3 stories and you allowed 4 stories. This is sort of an idea of what it would look like. And of course, we tend to point out that there are throughout Cambridge examples of these sort of non-conforming buildings. So you do have 4-story buildings kind of sprinkled within a lot of our residential neighborhoods. And then the same thing for 6 stories. These are areas of the city that are zoned, along major corridors and other sort of more densely developed areas that are a little bit outside of the kind of traditional residential neighborhoods of Cambridge. And the 7-story development would be the maximum in some of our higher density zoning districts. Because districts abut one another, there's provisions for, as you get closer, as you're in a higher density district or higher height district and you get closer to a lower height district, there would be a scaling down. And like with typical zoning, there are requirements for setbacks and open space. Generally, you could build what the base zoning allows in terms of setbacks and open space requirements, but in situations where the zoning is more restrictive, you would follow a much simpler 30% open space requirement and setback requirements of, actually I think it's 15 feet if it's a more restrictive district in the front, 20 feet in the rear, and 7.5 feet on the sides. Parking was an interesting discussion. So we did a lot of work to figure out and this has been a conversation sort of throughout Cambridge. We could have a whole separate conversation about parking. But when it comes to housing development, there's a demonstrated lower demand for parking in Cambridge than might be expected or might be required under the zoning ordinance. For affordable housing, some analysis was done to show what the average parking demand is for development in this category, and it tends to be about 0.4, 4 spaces for every 10 units is kind of like where it lands. We talked about this with the city council. It was actually the city council that pushed for eliminating parking requirements altogether, and I think that this is part of a larger planning discussion of while there may be demand for parking from all types of housing, including affordable housing, really what's the trade-off of priorities? Because if you require the construction of more parking, that inevitably is going to mean less housing. There's always that kind of trade-off in terms of space, real estate, funding, and from an urban design perspective too, which we'll talk about a little bit. Parking is not really the most desirable use, especially if you want to try to fit into the character of neighborhoods where Cambridge was built before pre 1924. There's not a whole lot of parking in a lot of these neighborhoods. Sorry. One of the things that's interesting about this is that it has some provisions for preservation of existing buildings. So it allows a lot of flexibility if you're working within an existing building to create additional units within the building, to by not having to deal with density requirements or parking requirements. There's a lot that can be done, and there's a lot of larger buildings, oversized sort of buildings in Cambridge, and there's a lot of examples where buildings are preserved for their historic value. Cambridge has a very active historic preservation program, and so in cases where you might want to build affordable housing, a site might provide an opportunity for that, but at the same time there's buildings that are expected to be preserved, this zoning creates a tool that makes it easier to do that. Instead of development review, so a lot of development in Cambridge is subject to discretionary review and approval, and a lot of that review is based on urban design. So since there isn't that binding review process, there's a set of building and urban design standards that apply, and these are meant to align with the city's general urban design objectives, which are trying to promote pedestrian friendliness, trying to prioritize pedestrian and bicycle movement as opposed to prioritizing parking and auto uses. trying to make sure that there's active facades where there's enough there's transparency, especially at the ground floor, but also on upper floors, and that there's articulation in buildings. And that's really one of the things that's really typical of development in Cambridge. There's you find lots of architectural styles in Cambridge, but it's a very fine-grained type of urban fabric. So it's important to have that incorporated into affordable housing as well as into market rate and other development. And environmental performance standards, the city has environmental design and development requirements. These continue to apply for affordable housing overlay projects. That was something that was thought about very carefully. And in fact, it's the case in Cambridge that if you look at our affordable housing development, it tends to be some of the most efficient and the most sustainably designed housing that we find in the city, because they're being developed by organizations that generally have a long-term interest in them. They're trying to keep long-term costs down, and so there's a lot of incentive for affordable housing developers to make the buildings as sustainable as possible. And then the final piece, despite the notion of having an as-of-right permitting path, there is still a desire to have input into the design process. So there is in fact, this is more, even though it's non-binding, which is really the key aspect of this, this is a more extensive design review process than projects that require discretionary permits are subject to. So for an affordable housing development, before it can get a building permit, it has to go through community meetings. It has to go to the planning board for design consultation to get comments. Then it has to be revised and then come back to the planning board so that the developer can describe to the planning board how they've responded to those comments. The planning board makes a final report on that. And this is all, again, non-binding. It's all advisory. And it ultimately goes to the issuer of building permits in the city and if they've followed all the steps in the process and if they conform with the zoning, to get a building permit. As part of this design review process, it was really critical to the city council that the city have design guidelines in place. So the city's urban design staff spent a lot of time working with a consultant to put together a set of design guidelines that would inform, and really it's meant to inform everyone involved in the process: the affordable housing developers, the funders who are looking at these developments for funding, the planning board as part of the review process, the community. It really serves all those purposes. And this is just a kind of quick summary. If we ever need to go back and talk about this a little bit more, if you want to focus on some specific elements of the zoning, we can go back and do that. But just to take us to the end of the story where we are now. So this was adopted less than a year ago. We already have a number of developments that are in the kind of the pre-application review stage. So there have been 3 developments that have gone into community meetings, have discussed what they intend to do, and they're showing how the development kind of fits within the zoning parameters. And there's a lot more that are kind of in discussion or ready to go forward. So we're still very early in the process where we haven't yet seen one of these developments play all the way out, but based on the interest that we're seeing so far, it seems like it's off to a pretty strong start. That's it. That's me and Cassie, and we'll just turn it over back to you, Joe, or the moderator who wants to, however you want to do questions.
Oh, you're muted, Joe.
Thank you. So I think what we're going to do now is have everybody enter our Zoom room, and as Michelle's pulling them all in, I'm assuming they're going to be able to still hear as we talk. One thing that came to mind as you were going through, Jeff, is zoning is very complex and it's confusing to non-planners. Can this event or this process occur without changing the entire zoning code? Because there's so many communities throughout the Hudson Valley where their zoning has been established in the 60s and they haven't done a rezoning. They've done some portions of zoning changes, but not in an entire city or an entire community. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's a great point and a great question. And I think that the way that we've approached this in Cambridge, it's not a complete it wasn't a complete rezoning. It wasn't a total overhaul of the entire zoning ordinance. What it was is we call it an overlay. So if you think about overlay zoning, it's zoning that modifies what the base zoning is. It doesn't completely remove it or supersede it. It just kind of creates another layer on top that says, okay, here's what, there's base zoning that says you can do this, but then we're going to create another layer that says that, in certain circumstances, you can do this other thing. And it really was important to the process to make sure that the overlay was as simple as possible, and that it didn't get overcomplicated, so that we could show people that, really what it is, if you're in a residential neighborhood, the affordable housing overlay within these parameters, if it's 100%, deed restricted affordable housing, you can go to 4 stories. You can build a 4-story building and just kind of start with that as a simple approach. I think when you get into things, I think that's part of the reason why this, I think the approach was chosen both for practical purposes, because a simpler zoning approach helps enable development to move forward. And in Cambridge, there's a lot of different types of sites that affordable housing might get built on. So the zoning has to be somewhat flexible to accommodate that, but also because it's much easier to explain to people. When you get into things like FAR and lot area unit per unit density and things, it is easy to get people lost. And people were, and originally, I would say early in the process, we were talking about it in those terms of density, and we were out in the community as part of the Envision Cambridge process, talking to neighborhood groups about it. And one of the pieces of feedback we kept getting was, we don't really understand this. You're talking about FAR, but it doesn't make any sense to us. So we said, well, let's put FAR aside and just talk about it in terms of height and dimensions, and be able to show pictures so people can really understand what that means.
Sure. And Jeff, I think that's a great segue actually into another question. In some communities, there's a feeling of a top-down approach in terms of, this is the policy, we're setting it, everybody has to deal with it. But in Cambridge, you went through this process and you established something called Envision Cambridge. And Cassie, maybe you could speak to how that community engagement process worked and the amount of feedback that was received. The first vote was 5-4, then it was 7-2. So what made the change? How did that all come together?
Yeah, I think it was a really interesting and very useful process going through the discussions about the overlay subsequent to after the Envision Cambridge process had ended. Envision Cambridge preceded the overlay, and there was a large group of representative community members that were part of a housing group that met to address and sort of map out potential solutions to problems that Cambridge was facing from the housing perspective. And affordability is at the top. And I think there was a question about the 100% affordable nature of the overlay, and then also whether mixed income is better, or whether pursuing policies where that would result in sort of informally affordable housing, affordable with a lowercase a. And Envision Cambridge put forth policies that would promote all of those types of solutions that could potentially result in those types of results. At the same time, Cambridge is such a high cost community. There are no bad sites. We don't have abandoned buildings. We call an underutilized site a fully functioning, single story building that could be a bigger building, but there isn't the same type of opportunity to encourage just sort of affordable housing naturally occurring. Unfortunately, that really ended when rent control went away in the mid-90s. And so in order to ensure that housing remains affordable to lower income households, we have to put in serious subsidies to just make the numbers work, and then also protect that affordability over time with a deed restriction. At the same time, the Envision Cambridge process did come up with plans for increasing the overall supply of housing, with the hope that over time, in the distant future, supply could get closer to meeting the demand, and so there could be more of a that there could be more opportunities for sort of informally affordable housing. So that there was a pretty robust conversation in the community about whether that is the right way to create affordability in the community, whether it's build more or whether it's to protect what we have, or to reduce density, and to make, if we're building more and what's being built is mixed income, is that then driving the prices in the rest of the city? So it was an interesting conversation, and out of that came this idea of helping us create the permanently affordable housing and the overlay, and the 100% nature of it, that does come up often, and in other communities that might not work as well as it does in Cambridge. As Jeff was showing in his presentation, there is a really big range of housing stock in the same block in the city. There are not, in the same neighborhood, you're going to have among the most wealthy people in the state living right next to a public housing development, so that this is really to maximize the availability of affordable units, so that once a site is secured, we can leverage that resource to create as many affordable units as possible, given the demand. But
Sure.
But as Jeff also mentioned, we do have an inclusionary zoning program, which has resulted in mixed income developments throughout the city, because any private residential development that's been created in the last 20 years has a set aside of affordable units that are mixed within those buildings.
Thanks, Cassie. So, you mentioned a couple of things. Cost, the cost in New York State, very similar to what you're seeing in Cambridge. And the amount of money that has to come in as a subsidy to be able to drive down the rents to make it affordable, extremely similar. And the other similar thing that I wanted Daniel to get to is the similarities in New York State and Massachusetts in terms of home rule and that whole process, which can be very confusing and time consuming. So Daniel, if you could tell us the similarities there.
Yeah, it's a great question, Joe. And so kind of harkening back to, our first days in planning school, home rule kind of establishes that governance structure that municipalities can, as Jeff mentioned at the outset of our presentation, control their own kind of planning and development destiny. So I've worked in a couple communities in the Hudson Valley, and then, have been working in Cambridge for about a year and a half now. And the challenges are very similar. In places like the Hudson Valley, there's so many different municipalities that are rather insulated in kind of how their development patterns work and what their zoning and development policy is. And that's, I'd venture to say that's not uncommon in Boston either. What's tricky is that can create kind of disparities in how affordable housing production occurs. So in the Hudson Valley, and I don't want to call out individual municipalities, but you have places like the Portchesters that have really kind of shouldered the burden of kind of providing the region's affordable housing. And they're right next door to other municipalities that maybe aren't as open-minded or receptive to new affordable housing production. And what makes that particularly tough in terms of kind of solving the issue is that, the affordable housing issue isn't limited to kind of the political boundaries of a place. So affordable housing, is a regional challenge. And I think in many ways requires the cooperation and the collaboration of multiple municipalities to fix or to solve. And, having that kind of home rule system in place, makes that it adds one additional, I think, barrier to having kind of true impactful change. So that's kind of one issue. The other one difference I'll point out, and we can get into this, later, is that New York has seeker, which kind of has its hands in the changes to municipal policy require a seeker evaluation. And in Massachusetts, there's a little bit more flexibility in terms of a local municipality being able to adopt zoning amendments and not having to go through like a statewide environmental review process for that. So that's also kind of a big difference. But yeah, I'll stop there. And I don't know if Jeff or Cassie wanted to add anything to that.
A couple other. Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I would just add that for broader context of this area, I don't know much about the sort of New York area, but it is as Daniel noted, it is a regional issue, and in addition to a lot of these efforts that we've been taking in Cambridge, there is a larger regional coalition that has been focusing a lot of attention on housing affordability and really trying to move the region as a whole, more in the direction of being open to more affordable housing development. And one of the things that I mentioned, I kind of skirted by this really quickly, but earlier this year, the state, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts passed a what's called housing choice legislation, which is it's not, in some ways it's not much, but it kind of breaks the historical patterns by putting some additional state requirements on municipal and some kind of boundaries on how municipalities can go about regulating housing. And two of the things that are key are it changed the statute for adopting zoning amendments. So if a zoning amendment that is intended to promote multifamily housing development or increase density of housing or in various other ways make housing easier, it only requires a simple majority vote now. And that's particularly relevant because we have a city council, but you don't have to get very far outside of Cambridge before you have governments that still operate on a town meeting style of government. So that's really relevant. And the other thing is, in areas that have access to regional transit, there's a mandate that they zone portions of those communities to allow multifamily housing. And it's interesting and surprising that you can go to places that have rapid transit access and you still find that it's restrictively zoned to single family homes.
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. We had another question came up in the chat bar. What input, if any, did the school district have in this process? So school districts may be set up a little different than in New York. So I don't know, Cassie, did you want to take that? You were speaking of the Envision piece. So
yeah, I was going to say, just to tie back to that. So the Envision was a broad citywide planning process that had a lot of input from all of the city stakeholders, including the school department played some role, and we also did a number of population projections and projections on schools and other things. And Jeff may have more insight on where some of those things landed, but there was there is an overall awareness of how the anticipated build out, both as might be generated by the overlay. There was also another question about what impact do we anticipate the overlay will have, and is there sort of a limit on how many overlay projects could be created? And the reality is prices in Cambridge are so high, and opportunities to secure sites will remain limited in terms of competing for sites, that it's not anticipated that there will be an overlay project on every block. But overall, there was consideration to city planning goals as that would impact schools. And I would just say, having worked somewhat in other communities in Massachusetts, Cambridge is generally very supportive of maintaining a healthy number of school children in the community. And whereas some communities are more concerned about multifamily housing because of the cost impact it would have on the schools, oftentimes the Cambridge community is more in favor of that, to make sure that we maintain, because it, as it was also noted, that we do have a lot of universities and a lot of young people and a lot of older older families living in Cambridge, but that school age population is the group that is most at risk of getting priced out given the prices in Cambridge. And just to tie back to the question about sort of the bottom up, top down process, the overlay was only made possible because of that extended planning process that preceded the ultimate vote in favor. And we're seeing the results of that now as projects go through the process, where we have people involved in the conversations that were unaware of affordable housing, were unaware of zoning, but participated in the many different types of outreach that we had to explain the need for this and what was behind this. And I think it overall has helped make individual members of the community that might not have considered the importance of these kinds of interventions now at least understanding them. Whether they're always fully supportive is a different matter, but they do understand the reasoning behind it.
Sure. Thanks, Cassie. We're going to jump to another question. We have a couple more minutes left. Do the set-asides established for affordable housing, is there an opt-out feature? And if so, how does that work?
So I think that question probably has more to do with inclusionary housing policy, which is separate. So for market rate development, this is all predates the affordable housing overlay, and it really is not part of the affordable housing overlay. The current requirement is that 20% of development of 10 units or more has to be affordable to low and moderate income, and there's no buyout provision. So it's kind of the second time we've been asked that. We got to ask your question a lot, and Cambridge has been pretty intent on, like as I said, there are funding sources for affordable housing in Cambridge. We're not looking to our zoning, except in the case of, we are to the extent that our zoning provides a funding stream for affordable housing, it's on non-residential development. The city has done, nexus studies establishing that linkage fees can be charged for non-residential development in the city, given that it creates demand for affordable housing. But when it comes to building housing, the units are much more important to the city than using that as a source of funding.
Just to tack onto that too, because this comes up a lot in Cambridge, you can't put your inclusionary requirement off-site either. It's got to be on-site. I know in New York, some municipalities allow an off-site option.
Thanks, Daniel. Another question, and if I get this question wrong, Carl, I apologize, but there are some communities, college towns, and we have a couple here in the Hudson Valley. How does the concept of the town gown interplay affect the housing dynamic in Cambridge? There's so many universities.
I think that in terms of the traditional sort of town gown, like residents of Cambridge versus, people that live in, work and go to school at the universities, there might be, but I think a lot of the people that live in Cambridge also have attended the universities. I think most people would probably say that it puts pressure on the prices because it brings in more people that need to live in proximity, that drives the prices. And we work closely with the universities to help solve both their housing needs as well as have them help solve the community's housing needs. And in the case of both MIT and Harvard, we've had different programs and worked with them on making sites available that they are not using, that they donate to the city for affordable housing. So it can be fraught like any sort of town gown situation, but it's a valuable member of the community, and so it's a long time, has sort of permanent aspect of Cambridge.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I was just add, Cambridge is, it's sort of fair to call it a college town, although it probably different from from a lot of college towns in that the Harvard and MIT are the largest employers in the city, but certainly not the only employers, and by no means are the only drivers of the economy. So there's really a much more sort of diverse set of economic activity, and just the residential community is very diverse in Cambridge. So while Harvard, the influence, as Cassie noted, the influence does kind of permeate the community in various ways. It's not a situation where there's sort of a clear divide between a college community and then kind of an outer community.
And what's the mix between home ownership and rental in the city?
Go ahead.
It's about 2/3 renters, 1/3 homeowners.
Okay. All right. I think we have time for one last question. What kinds of rental subsidies are available through Cambridge to support affordable? Are there Section 8 programs or other things available?
Yeah, we have a really robust Cambridge Housing Authority. It's a moving to work authority, so they have sort of special ability to set up some of their own sort of tailored, individualized programs. So they make Section 8 available through project-based and other means. And then we have, affordable housing that's created through the overlay and other means that would be affordable by nature of the rent limitations that are made possible through the programs.
It's amazing the similarities that we share, and I want to thank you all. We're at the end of our time, but I think clearly by the number of questions that had come in, and as this conversation continues, there's probably another dozen questions that would pop up. But in appreciation of everyone's time, especially yours, we greatly appreciate having you as our guests and explaining everything that has gone on in Cambridge. And I think we take away a lot of very useful tools from this conversation. So again, thank you very much. And in closing, I'd like to, from the Center for Housing Solutions, I'd like to thank our investors and sponsors for this program: Howard Hanna Rand Realty, the Carney Group, Community Preservation Corporation, Rupco and Hudson River Housing, Leviticus Fund and TD Bank, Kirchhoff and Baxter Development, and of course, NeighborWorks America. So thank you again this morning for joining, and come back in June for our